Treador, you got the call.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Well, getting a lecture from a fake Harvard graduate over there is just a little bit much. And when I
Point of order, Deputy Speaker.
Member for Maroochydore, take your seat.
Be very careful.
Minister,
Be very careful.
Minister, through the chair.
I take offence and ask that it be withdrawn.
Do you withdraw?
I withdraw. When we know that there are ministers who want to lecture people about the truth, and yet their CVs claimed that they had master's degrees from a university in the US by no less than the name of Harvard.
Member for Maroochydore, take your seat. Member for Buderim, you're warned under standing orders. Member for Maroochydore, you have the floor.
At least that movie Clueless, I think the heroine of that went to Harvard Law School and did the work. But then there's ministers of this government who aren't just clueless, they're hopeless. And when we look at the title of this piece of legislation, Debt Reduction and Savings Bills 2021, it could be a comedy. It could be a comedy, but unfortunately it's not even a drama, it's probably a tragedy. And we see this Labor government actually doing a bit of a shuffle-roo, a bit of a switcheroo on some of their own policies they announced only a few years ago, which were supposed to save buckets of money and make efficiencies in government and drive the infrastructure program just as one. So a number of the initiatives that this Labor government introduced into this parliament only a few years ago are now being wiped out. And yet, suddenly it's reborn, perhaps a bit like a rewrite of a bad script. We're seeing the Productivity Commission, which I think had a lot of merit, introduced by the now Speaker, who was then the Treasurer of Queensland, and it was to be an independent authority that would bring a statutory independence to productivity issues here in Queensland. But it wrote some reports that this Labor government didn't like, and, well, they rewrote that out of the script. They thought that was not giving them the answers they wanted. Heck, an independent voice which would bring about an insight into the way that government should be run, and they didn't like it. So here we are. It's going. It's out the door. Cut. And what about Building Queensland? Only a few years ago. It was such a great idea, brought in by a previous Labor Treasurer, and it was hailed as being this idea that would have independence for building cases here in Queensland, that would business cases on infrastructure here in Queensland. And when it was introduced exactly 6 years ago, then Deputy Premier and Planning Minister Jackie Trad hailed it. So there was a pre-election promise to create an independent statutory body to ensure a whole-of-government perspective is brought to major infrastructure planning, prioritisation and investment. But now they're getting rid of that. So obviously somebody must have given them an independent report they didn't really like, and now that's being written out. Just change the script, change the story, pretend it didn't happen. But that happened under this government, and I think there's been people in industry who have spoken about what they believe were benefits of Building Queensland, and certainly the need to ensure that business cases are independently presented and also presented and able to stand rigour and scrutiny. But rigour and scrutiny isn't exactly a strong point of this Labor government. And they create the statutory or independent bodies, they get answers they don't like, so they get rid of them. And the story goes on. I want to address the issue, though, of infrastructure and the need for timely, effective, efficient investment in infrastructure. And we now know that the backlog alone on maintenance on Queensland roads is topping, I'll get the latest figure, $6 billion. $6 billion. And a state that now has a treasurer that, when he came into that role, was asked what the debt of Queensland was. We had a treasurer, another treasurer. Yes, they wrote out of the script the previous treasurers, and a new treasurer under Minister Dick. And we see a situation when he came into that role, he didn't even know what the debt levels were in Queensland. But then I guess when you consider that the Premier didn't know what the GST rate was in Queensland, They're in great economic company, aren't they? So this Labor Treasurer now is presiding over heading towards $130 billion worth of debt in Queensland. And so perhaps the rating agencies are getting a bit nervous because they don't read Hollywood scripts, they read the numbers. And what they see in Queensland has been a ballooning debt with lower service levels and a lost opportunity of investment in timely and efficient infrastructure, but a waste in regard to the opportunity to really fire up the economies throughout Queensland. And I was in Western Queensland for the Western Council Alliance of Councils just last week, and you certainly see in those large parts of Queensland where there's opportunity with economic development, but they need the infrastructure to unlock that economic opportunity. We see that is true also in other parts of Queensland. The need for proper business cases, a pipeline of works and a steady stream of projects being brought to fruition. But tragically, because of the way that debt has been mismanaged and not used effectively with the right infrastructure, there are lost opportunities where we now see that figure I quoted before, over $6 billion worth of maintenance backlog just on our roads in Queensland. And it snowballs and it goes on. Our state has amazing resources and people who want to see it flourish, but they've been served by an economically inept and clueless and hopeless state Labor government. I want to address an issue that's been raised, certainly by colleagues of mine in their statement of reservation, and I think it's a backward step, and that's the move that makes it harder for papers, particularly newspapers in rural and regional areas, to be financially viable by allowing departments to not have to advertise in these papers. Now, I recognise there has been a shift to a lot of digital online platforms. And I have to state that as a former newspaper journalist, I do have a soft spot, but more than that, a belief and a passion about the need for journalists to be able to operate throughout all our communities in Queensland and not necessarily be employed by government. There are more journalists working for government these days than working in free enterprise media. We need a diversity of journalists working throughout the region. So the fact that this legislation is actually going to remove the requirement that there are also newspaper printed copies of summer advertising, I think is a backward step, particularly for those newspapers in areas where there is a desire to still maintain print-based newspapers to ensure accessibility for a wide range of community members, because not everybody is necessarily in the digital age. There are a variety of people in our state who want to access their news on a variety of platforms. I think that's a backward step, and one that doesn't necessarily save a lot of money but removes access. So, in regard to the other issue about building Queensland, I think I've addressed that, but I think that's also an example where this government really has got no consistency in respect to how they're going to truly have a pipeline of infrastructure that's built to service all areas of this state, whether it's from the Great West or to our east coast, from the north to the south. And the lack of a pipeline of works has really been exposed during this time of opportunity for COVID or infrastructure to stimulate the economy. There was a lack of pipeline of work throughout the state to take the opportunity and to move that forward. And that's a great shame, because Queensland was already behind the 8 ball in regard to timely investment, not just a few hero projects with PR statements from ministerial officers, but the figures have shown that Queensland as a state government has underinvested state dollars in state infrastructure, and then they pick a few hero projects, tendency to blow their costs, and certainly what we've seen with their so-called best practice principles, which is just an excuse for a 30% hike for their union mates, rather than for Australian-based civil construction industry to have that pipeline of works from mum and dad businesses throughout this state and local communities, so that we not only have the multinationals drinking at the trough, we have a variety of small to medium-sized civil infrastructure companies able to enter into and access that pipeline of infrastructure wherever they live in Queensland.